Yeah, so with that, I just want to thank Diane, Marcia, and Jana for all being here today. I'm really excited about this. These three people are heavy hitters in the realm of youth farm safety, people that I have been familiar with and looked up to for quite some time. And when Angie and I were planning this series and knew that we wanted to do a youth farm safety webinar as a part of it, I mean, these were the names that were in my head pretty instantly. So I'm so glad that all three of you are able to join us. And that's kind of the cool thing about this virtual world that we're living in now, that we're able to come together from all these different areas across the country to have these really important conversations. So what I want to do first, I know that each of you kind of introduced yourselves and where you work already, but if you each want to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to talk a little bit more about, you know, specifically what you do with your organization, what some of your big projects are, and then we can dive into some questions for the day. So why don't we start with Diane?
All right. So I have been working with farming communities for many years. I'm not going to give you a time frame, but that has work has looked at exposures that kids who live with parents who are farmers or who are farm workers that they may bring home. And certainly a concern there, and a lot of work I've done when I was out in Oregon was with pesticide exposure. You know, we want to make sure that that stays in the field and doesn't get into the homes, and how do we protect those workers? Another aspect is looking at young workers, and I'll talk more about that later on too. But you know, when we think about young workers, you know, kids in farming get involved at very early ages, and that's great. We want them involved, especially if it's a family farm operation. But we need to be careful that we protect them, because we all know there's a lot of hazards on the farms, and kids may not know what those hazards are. They're not as experienced as adults. And then they also may have smaller body sizes, so they may not be able to do the same things, not as strong. And, you know, if we think about, you know, a lot of my work has been with adolescents, and, you know, I go up to young adults. So when we think about, you know, young workers, and Marcia will agree, is, you know, we know the bodies and brains are still developing into your early 20s. And if anybody here has kids at home, you can probably relate to that. Or if you're young, think back on your time. So we want to think about those other factors that can impact safety too. So that's where my work has been. And, you know, when we think about who has control, a lot of times it's not the youth on the farms that have control. It's the parents or the supervisors, or even the ag teacher if it's an ag education program. So thinking about how do we get them to think more about safety has been a focus.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Diane. Marcia.
So we actually own a farm, and I grew up on a farm, and we still have part of that farm that I own with my brothers and sisters. So that kind of made this job a really natural fit for us as we started moving into it. But even at that, I wasn't aware when I started in this position 10 years ago, just how dangerous this position can be. I knew greatly and was absolutely on board with the benefits of growing up on farms, you know, and instilling the great work ethic and teaching responsibility, and I mean lots and lots of benefits. But I wasn't aware of just how hazardous the job could be. And so that was a real eye-opener for me when I started at the Children's Center, and we started getting these news articles coming across our desk of all these children that were being injured. And so we started, it very much positioned me to think about, now what do we need to do to start protecting these children? And so we started looking at things like safe play areas, and I've been involved with that program and getting the booklets updated and that type of stuff. We just redid all of the agricultural youth work guidelines, and so I led the development on that project as well. I've also done a lot of work on agritourism. So agritourism's just exploded across the country, and we have around 23 million children every year that go out to farms and ranches that are, a lot of them, totally unfamiliar with the environment. So I've been doing a lot of work in that area as well. And we've also been doing things like looking at the migrant children and what are the child care services that are available for them or not available for them. We've done some work with the Anabaptist populations as well. So really a little bit across the board, anything we can do that we can kind of affect or effect will have an effect on those children.
Great, thanks, Marcia. And Jana.
All right. Well, my story, I actually started out very similar to Emily and Angie in the extension world. So I worked for Penn State Extension for 10 and a half years right after I graduated from college. And I was always involved with youth development, was a 4-H member myself. So it was as Marcia said, it was a natural fit to me growing up around animals and just really enjoying working with youth and having them see their full potential. And I actually discovered Progressive Agriculture Safety Days. I always say it by accident, in a sense. I was called right after I got home from my honeymoon, and my neighboring, the neighboring educator in a local community was offering a Progressive Agriculture Safety Day. And she asked me if I would want to come to present. She knew that I'd be a good presenter and I enjoyed working with children. So I said, sure, I'll take you up on that. And I fell in love. I left there and I didn't understand why we were not hosting one here in my local community. And so I joined as her assistant coordinator the following year to kind of get my feet wet and experience it. And then I dove right in as a coordinator. So I had been involved with the Safety Day program technically since 2005. And I just love that we can package a program that's easy enough for someone who's just someone in a community that's concerned, whether it's a parent, whether it's an extension educator, FFA chapter, and they can run with it and make it very hands-on and fun and informative for our youth. That's really exciting. It's not all about lecturing. It's really getting them to experience it hands-on. It's learn by doing approach. So I really enjoy that. And in a non-COVID year, we would potentially be having 400 safety days all throughout North America. So we had to switch gears last year and move a lot virtually, but we were still able to reach kids. We had that motto last year, if the child can't come to a safety day, we're going to bring that safety day to the child. So I serve in my role, just real quickly, as the education content specialist. I am in charge of the curriculum. So I'm always trying to develop new curriculum. As Marcia said, she's always updating her resources. We're in the same boat right now, trying to update them, give them a fresh look, and also add some new chapters where we're working on just launched a mental well-being and stress management chapter for our youth. Vaping is another hot topic that we're tackling. And also we have others that we're working on to give folks a choice to customize their event to their needs of their local community.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. So now, I really just want to dive right into it right off the bat here. And I'm just wondering, for all of our panelists, what are some of the big picture things that we should know about the nature of farm accidents specifically that involve children?
Go ahead, Marcia.
Okay, happy to. So I think the overall picture, and you've heard all of us allude to this already, is we know that while there's a lot of benefits to working on the farm, there's a lot of hazards and a lot of risks there as well. And we know that agriculture in the United States is one of the most hazardous industries that we have. We also know that every day there's about 33 children that are seriously injured in an agricultural related incident. And when we're talking about these children being seriously injured, we're talking about if they were an adult, a working adult, they would actually be off of work for this type of an incident. So when we're talking injured, we're not talking about falling down and scraping their knees. We also know that about every 3 days, a child dies in an agricultural related incident. And we know that for working youth, since 2009, we know that more youth have died working in agriculture than all other industries combined. We also know that about 60% of the injuries, flipping over to the injury side, about 60% of the injuries that occur actually occur to children that are not working. And that happens in the agricultural work site because it's one of the only work sites in the country where children of any age can be. You can take a 2-year-old onto a farm work site and into a tractor cab. We certainly don't recommend it, but you can certainly do it, and people do it. So it's one of those things about balancing having the children in the work site. And we know that there's about 900,000 children that actually live on farms. We know that more than half of those kids work on those farms. And we also know that an additional 260 some thousand youth are hired to work on farms. So we are talking about well over 1 million children across the US that are impacted by the agricultural environment.
I think I might just add in, I hope that's okay, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
You know, think about what are the things that put kids at risk anyways, you know, so we know that young workers are injured more often than older workers. And a lot of that's inexperience. And then I mentioned things like strength and body size, decision-making abilities, all of those play a role. With other youth too, you've got distractions. So maybe they're busy with school, they have lots of commitments there. And then the other point just totally escaped my head. You know, thinking about, oh, they're reluctant to speak up. You know, that's a classic thing, is especially, you know, adolescents, is they don't want to show they don't know how to do something. And, you know, if you're somebody who's been working on the farm all the time, you may forget what it's like to be new. So you may not think that, gosh, they've never done this task, or they've only watched me do it. Do they really know how to do it? So thinking about ways that you can help make sure you're not in a situation where you ask a yes or no question, you know, hey, Angie, do you know how to drive the tractor? She's going to say yes. And instead of saying, you know, well, can you walk me through it? You know, show me a little bit more. You know, you want to make sure you build in some of those things.
That's a great point, Diane. And it kind of leads back to the point we talked about, that about every 3 days that a child and a youth dies in agriculture related incident. And we also know that over the course of from in the age group of 15 to 17-year-olds, about 81% of the occupational injuries are in the agricultural environment. And one of the main reasons that we are seeing such a high fatality rate in these groups, in these youth that are working in ag, is because many times these youth are doing jobs that don't match their abilities. And kind of like what Diane just mentioned, we're not talking about just physical abilities. So the youth may be tall enough to reach all the controls, and they might be strong enough to be able to repeatedly operate them, but maybe they don't have the reaction time that's needed. Maybe they don't have the field of vision that they need. You know, maybe their cognitive, their mental abilities just aren't there. And so if we can find a way to match the youth's abilities to the job that we're asking them to do, we could cut the rate of these injuries and fatalities by over 50%. And that's one of the purposes of the Ag Youth Work Guidelines that we've developed. And when you pair that with the supervisor training that came out of Iowa and the Children's Center as a collaborative project, that can reduce those numbers of injuries even more.
And I'll just piggyback and say, with some of those numbers that Marcia shared, it just emphasizes, you know, the point that most of these incidents are preventable. That's the most heartbreaking thing. And that is why education, I think, is needed and is so important. So as a parent, as a grandparent, I think we need to remember that we're our child's first teacher. And we need to always be role modeling that safe and healthy behavior. We need to not have a do as I say, not as I do mentality. We have to know that there's eyes always watching us, and we really need to be role modeling all the time. One thing we hear so often, and I'm sure, you know, Marcia and Diane, with some of the articles that we read or these news stories, you know, you hear this phrase, if only. So many parents have to say, if only. If only I would have known. If only I would have locked the shed. If only I would have made him wear a helmet. And that's going to haunt a family, a parent, siblings, the rest of their lives. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we try to do storytelling as best we can, share these stories. It's heartbreaking for these families to tell their stories, but it's needed because someone may be listening in and thinking, wow, this could have happened to me. I allowed my child to do the same thing. So that's really important. And using that, as I mentioned earlier, that fun, hands-on approach can really drive those points home and make it happen.
Yeah, thank all three of you for sharing that. I mean, and just going back to, Marcia and Diane, you guys really talked about some really alarming big statistics. I mean, these are not small numbers that we're working with by any means. And so in going back to looking at those statistics for those children working on the farm, what are the biggest hazards that you've seen when it comes to these statistics?
So I'll jump in. ATVs certainly are a part of it. Livestock, unpredictable, bigger than most of us. And also other things, we focus a lot on traumatic injuries, which is important, but let's think long-term. Let's think about hearing loss. There's a lot of noisy equipment, there's a lot of noisy places on the farm, and that's going to have long-term impacts. Same thing with some of the other exposures that might be in a livestock building that could have some respiratory effects.
So Diane, when you say livestock, give us a little more of an example. I mean, this isn't a child that's taking their steer to the county fair, right? This would you want to give us some examples of what you mean by livestock incidences?
So things where you become close to the animals. So maybe it's when you're feeding them, maybe when you're moving them, where there's no safety barrier there, and unfamiliarity with the task, and inexperience. And also, livestock, the main thing we know is to remain calm. That's good for everybody. And if you have somebody who's maybe a little bit nervous, maybe a little bit distracted, that's going to be conveyed, and that's where you're going to start to see things. And we all know this, we're in a hurry. You're in a hurry, you're late for school, you're slept late, got to do this, got to do that, want to go, FaceTime with your friends, or I don't think they do that anymore, play games. That's when you're going to start to see where you rush and you take those shortcuts. Marcia, do you have more to add?
Well, I was just thinking ahead to things where sometimes the supervisors don't necessarily think ahead. So maybe they're herding some cattle and there's no escape route. They end up in this pen with these cattle and they didn't plan ahead and they don't have an escape route for them. Or they're trying to herd them into this truck and they don't have things set up the way that they need to be. I think about things like in the swine barns, the noise levels in swine barns can be just horrendous and do a very rough number on anybody's hearing that's in there. And interestingly enough, there's even been some studies that show that it can affect the unborn child's hearing while they're in the womb of the mother. So, as Diane mentioned, it's not necessarily just injury prevention, like when we think about, well, I don't have an escape route with the cattle or something like that, but it can also be actual health, like our hearing, our respiratory, those types of things. And one of the things to keep in mind is that those things that Diane and I both mentioned, the vibration from the equipment, the noise from the equipment. Sometimes if you've got older equipment, you can have exhaust leaks, all of these types of things. They're hazardous to the workers. Now let's take and put a 2-year-old child on top of here, or even some people put babies in here. People talk about mounting car seats to the floor of their tractors and stuff. Now think about, what are you doing with the vibration, the exhaust fumes, the noise, all of that, and you're exposing this child to that. So it's something to think about, that all of these exposures are to these adults, they're to these working youth. But if we elect to take these small children into this work site, now we're exposing them as well. So just something to think about.
I like your point, Marcia, about you got to get rid of this hazards in the first place. That's good for everybody. You want to make sure tasks are done safely, and and raise awareness. I think that's where Jana's programs really come into play too. Is you're starting to make the kids aware of things, so they go home and ask their parents about things, and you can
they become the teacher in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I can't tell you, just as an example that I think a lot of people are familiar with, how many people have told me that, well, I finally quit smoking because my kids just kept bugging me, and so I finally did it. And I think that that's a great way or a great example of how the children can teach the parents. And they bring home the materials and the information from these safety days, and parents are always interested in what their children did that day. And so it's a great teaching opportunity. On the flip side of that is what Diane said earlier in the webinar, is that the adults are the ones that have the control in the environment. So they set the rules, they provide the training, they can address the hazards in the environment, they can make sure the tractor has a rollover protective structure on it. They're the ones who assign the tasks. So the adults really have a lot of control. And so really the best scenario is if we have both the children and the youth, as well as the adults, all on board with the same information.
Yeah, and I think, you really emphasize that point too. All three of you have kind of talked about this, that two-way communication where it's not just necessarily the adult making all the calls and telling the youth what to do, but creating that space for farm youth to also be a part of some of these solutions. And we did get a question in the Q&A box that falls right in line with this question, so I'm going to ask it now. And this person wrote, Marcia, I believe it was you who said 260,000 youth are hired for farm work in addition to those that live on farms. Does this hiring of outside help increase the risk because some of these youth may not have the day-to-day farm experience prior to showing up for work?
Absolutely. That's a great point that they brought up, and that absolutely does increase the risk. And that's one of the areas where the supervisor training that Diane's group collaborated with the Children's Center on and they created is really effective, because if the supervisor goes through that training, then all of those points like that are brought to their attention. If you hire a child who's worked on the farm for a number of years, a teenager, they're going to be familiar with animals and animal behaviors and tractors and machinery and those types of things. But if you hire a youth who's never been on a farm, they're not going to recognize the hazards that are in that environment that somebody like myself who grew up on a farm, we're automatically going to know, don't walk up on the back end of a horse, and those types of things like that. You don't come up on their blind spot. You have to have your seatbelt on with your tractor, those types of things like that. And interestingly enough, not only with the working youth is that an issue, but it's also an issue in the agritourism environment. When you have people coming to visit a farm, you can also have a lot of injuries that occur there because people just don't realize that they can't come running up on, oh, this is such a cute baby calf. And they may not realize that that mother cow was going to be very protective of that calf because they're not familiar with animal behavior. They didn't grow up on a farm. So that's a great point.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Marcia. And I totally agree of kind of that. I tell people of all ages in terms of farm safety, it is so much better to be overtrained than undertrained. So even if you get the kind of sassy, yeah, I know that. When you're training somebody, better to double, triple check that they know it than to assume they know it if they don't. And those refreshers, I think, are always good. Even me sitting here listening to all of you talk, I'm remembering new things or, gathering new things. So I do want to move on though, kind of similar, but we've kind of touched on this, but for children that aren't actively helping with farm work, so farm children, but aren't on farm work. And Marcia, you shared that really interesting statistic about how I think it's 60% of kids involved in farm accidents aren't actively involved in the work when the accident occurs. So what are some of those risks and hazards that we should be aware of for farm youth not actively working on the farm?
So interestingly enough, one of the top hazards for non-working children is actually drowning. And when people think about drowning on farms and ranches, you need to think about not just the farm ponds, which with the advent of the increase in irrigation over the last 20 years, we're seeing a lot more ponds, not just on farms, but in rural areas in general. And so that's definitely increased the hazards, but also think about manure lagoons. For any operation that has manure lagoons, we unfortunately have seen story after story in the last several years of children that have drowned in these manure lagoons. Depending upon what statistic you look at and how people talk about things, they also talk about children and youth drowning in corn and in grain. That's also a suffocation issue. So when we talk about children and drowning, we're not necessarily talking about just the farm ponds. ATVs have become a huge issue in recent years in and on farms and ranches, but also just in the rural areas in general. And they of course have just, the number of injuries have become just astronomical in comparison to what they used to be as more and more people begin to operate these. And not just the ATVs, but the UTVs as well have become problematic. And one of the biggest problems with those is people putting the younger children in the cargo areas. And you don't even want to hear some of the stories we've heard about what's happened to some of those children when they got bounced or pulled out of there. So that's an issue. Animals, of course, are still an issue for the non-working children. Tractors remain the #1 issue for non-working children. We know that probably, we know that about 41% of we know that tractors are the #1 cause of fatalities for children. Let me put it that way, for young children, okay? And we know that giving children rides on the tractors is one of the main causes of it. These kids fall off, they get run over, they fall off of the back of a piece of equipment and into something that's being pulled behind it. We even had an incident where one child was riding in a combine. When the combine hit the bump, the windshield shattered and they fell through the windshield into the header of the combine. So this whole extra rider piece thing on tractors and equipment has just become a nightmare. And despite the best efforts of everybody in the community to try to get the words out about this, we know that about 40% of families still give their kids rides on tractors. And it's just something that we need to try to break that tradition. It's just not a safe tradition. So that still remains our #1 problem right now, is these extra riders on tractors for our young children. But certainly ATVs and drowning and animals, they all are still in that mix as well.
I agree with a lot of what Marcia just said. There was, as I was thinking about that question in my head, she was hitting all those important points. A couple other things for me is, one thing, young children, whether they're living on the farm or they're visiting the farm, sometimes it is looked at as a giant play area. They see the equipment, they want to climb on it. They see the animals, as Diane mentioned earlier, they want to run with them, they want to play with them. They're so cute, you know, they don't realize when they get up close that they also can have a mind of their own and can be dangerous. I always say I grew up with horses, and even the most calm horse, you know, can have a bad day. So you have to be really careful. So it's again, going back to that role modeling, setting those boundaries, and also, you know, telling children that this is a busy active workplace. I think of when I was a child and when I would visit my mom in her office, there were certain rules, expectations as a child that I would go in, you know, the farm, although it looks different, it's a different setting, those still need to be applied. Blind spots is another one I think we failed to mention. You know, children often think in the large equipment that they can be seen when they're out on the farm, and they can't. You know, that's one thing that hits home a lot. We actually just recently did a story with a young man, and that was kind of his incident. He dropped a phone. He assumed that the person driving the tractor would see him, and they didn't. Thank goodness that had a happy ending where the child did survive, but it was very traumatic for a year of his life. ATVs and UTVs, we've talked about that. I think that is such a huge hazard all throughout farms and ranches, rural communities. The thing is, there is not a one size fits all. I often see children on ATVs and UTVs that are just not the right size for them. The other big thing is the PPE. You know, they jump on there, they don't wear their helmet, they don't wear other clothing and boots and things that are going to protect them. They also, extra riders, you know, we talked about it on tractors, but adding any extra weight to that ATV, maybe it's a sprayer, maybe it's a hay bale, maybe it is a person. that is going to change the entire center of gravity, and that is going to lead, be more of an opportunity for a rollover to occur. And kids drive that same path and they get so comfortable, but they don't realize that one little thing that they do can change all of that. Just the last thing that I'll end with on this is children knowing what to do if an incident occurs. If somebody happens to be entrapped in grain, or they go in, one thing, that probably a lot of people were surprised about was the water that Marcia mentioned. If they are in water and they see someone in distress, a lot of children, sometimes their first instinct is to go in after the person. And that's only going to lead to another incident or another potential fatality. So teaching kids that they should call 911 and get help immediately is really important, rather than go in themselves and try to be the hero.
The other thing that would alleviate a lot of these issues, and Jana, I really like that you mentioned the blind spots. One of the things that we're seeing right now is skid steers, and people will haul the big round bales with skid steers, and that totally compromises field of vision. And if you have, or small children see dad pull into the yard with a big piece of equipment and they're so excited they go running out, and dad can't see them because the equipment's so large and they get run over. If we can keep these children from getting into these worksite areas, we can keep them in childcare when mom and dad are working, put them in a safe play area that's got a fence, that's got an actual physical boundary so they can't run out in front of this equipment. If we can actually get them out of that work site, it eliminates a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. And one of the things to keep in mind is that with the whole COVID situation right now, the whole pandemic situation right now, the children are home on the farms more than they've been. A lot of the schools are not back in yet. Some of them that are only in school a couple days a week physical, and the rest of the week is virtual. So the children are home more, and they have more opportunity to be out in these environments than what they ever were. And they're home during times of the year where they traditionally may not have been, during planting season, during harvest season, with planting season coming up. These are times where there's more equipment out, there's more work being done, they're more hazardous times of the year. And unfortunately, those are the times of year that we see more injuries and especially more fatalities. And so I think it's just important for everybody to keep that in their mind this year, that, planting season's coming up and we traditionally have a spike in these incidents. So with more children home more often, we need to be even more conscious of that and careful.
So for Diane and Jana, I've got a kind of an interesting side note. And so when I was sharing with our producers here about this farm safety webinar series and highlighting all our topics, and one of my producers instantly said, well, this youth farm safety one, you need to send that to our schools. Our students are the ones that really need to watch that. And Diane, you made such a great comment about this is not just the scale needs to balance both ways when it comes to, this is education for not only our youth, but also our parents. And so I ask you two, how do we make that connection? Jana, you work so much with, that is your job, working, progressive ag safety days and highlighting youth, but how do we really reach both sides to make that scale balance out when it comes to, this is both of our responsibility, parent, guardian, and children?
Well, I can start by saying that we do encourage at our safety day programs, I think in all of the topics that we talk to the children about, is to go home and teach your siblings, teach your parents, teach your grandparents. And so many kids will come up and they will tell on their parents and grandparents, say, my dad does not do this, my grandpa does not do this. So we tell them, go and teach them what you learned. It's great conversation. I always say the kids should never go home that day and stay at the dinner table, not have good discussion points. So we reach primarily, our age group is 4 to 13-year-olds. So they come to a safety day, what a traditional safety day looks like. And our primary audience is school-age children. 80% of our events are school safety days. They're part of the school program. And they will come out and they'll experience about 8 to 12 different topics. So they'll spend about 15 to 20 minutes at each station, not too much. Again, no lecture. We reinforce the points. They do some type of hands-on activity and demonstration and kind of revisit Q&A, and then they move on to the next one. So it's really fun, engaging, age appropriate. And then the other piece of that audience, so you're thinking, well, what about those older teens? We actually engage with them too as presenters. So our older 4-H teens, our FFA chapters and our FFA teens, they get to come and they learn not only communication and leadership skills, but they're learning about the topic, whether they know it or not. I think, Marcia, you said once in a webinar we were at that sometimes you need to hear something 7 times for it to really sink in. So if you think about that for the older youth who might think, yeah, I know this topic, I know safety, I don't need to know this. When they have to teach this lesson and repeat it over and over and over to these youth, it's going to finally sink in. So that's a really neat way that we're able to bring those older teens, and we're seeing a lot of them coming back to be, as they get older, when they graduate college, they come back either to volunteer or to become a coordinator themselves. So that lets me know that they saw a lot of value in it and that they learned something and they want to continue to give back. So
So I think Jana's right. I think you need to raise awareness among the workers. You need to train them so they know what to look for. They can ask questions. They can bring that home, and that's certainly an important step. But I'm going to encourage you to go up a step too and go to the supervisors. So you might think, well, I don't hire anybody, so I'm not a supervisor. Well, let's redefine supervisor. Are you a parent that you're assigning tasks? Are you having your children work alongside with you? Then you are a supervisor. Are you a teacher? Are you an ag educator? Where you're going to be teaching them how to do these tasks, and you may be actually performing those. So you are a supervisor there. And if you're an employer and hiring the kid next door to come over and work in the summer does make you a supervisor. And the reason why we focused on that level is because they're the decision makers. They're the ones that's going to say, okay, Angie, you're going to do this today. Emily's going to do that. And Marcia's going to do that. And so they're going to make some decisions there. They're also going to provide any training. The comment about, do we have people with no experience working? Absolutely. We've gotten our rural areas have become more a mix of farm and non-farm people. And, those kids are going to want summer jobs or an opportunity to work. So we need to realize they may have never been on a farm, or it's 2 generations away now. I hear that a lot with my students who are graduate students. So supervising, training, checking up on people. So when we took the idea that they're the decision makers and they have the control, they're going to provide any PPE that will be available. So they need to be aware of what the hazards are, but also what the risks are to their workers. And that's going to have a bigger impact than if it comes from the bottom up. So that's one way to think about that.
So Diane, or for any of you, so Jana, you talked about what you do for youth. Diane or Marcia, are there trainings for supervisors, like you said, which could be these parents, guardians? I mean, what's available out there?
I feel like you lobbed me a softball here, Angie. So we, and I know that the slides are going to be sent out, and these PowerPoint that you're going to get is chock full of resources. And, starting with Jana, with the young kids, through the Children's Center and through our work, these are all resources. For the most part, they're free or low cost. So that's the other thing. But we were funded through the Children's Center, where Marcia works, to develop a training for those supervisors. And when we developed the training, we said, we're not going to train people how to supervise someone milking a cow or, harvesting grain. We're going to focus on skills that they need to have that are more general and apply to everything. So our training is applicable to anyone, and it's for those 3 groups I've talked about, even a coworker who may act sort of as a de facto supervisor there. And it really is talking about being aware that there's a risk. So understanding that this is a concern. Why would I change my behavior if I don't think there's a problem? So we want to start by saying there is a problem and we give examples, and then we focus on the skills. And the skills are ask open-ended questions, use the teach back method for training. That's where you show someone how to do it, you have them explain it back, and then you watch them do it. Supervising, modeling safe behavior. Janice talked a lot about that. I think that's a really great thing. Yeah, you always need to wear your seatbelt, but I'm not going to use it. Don't use your cell phone when you're driving, but I'm going to do that. So, really, trying to get those skills there is important. And I'm going to do my other shameless plug here is we have this online training. It is available both in English and Spanish, but we also have the videos. So maybe you don't want to take an online training. You can pull out a video if you're doing a safety day with high school students, pull out one of those and talk through it. So there's short activities that you can do on a break. We call them toolbox talks, which is, I'm going to start the summer off. We're going to walk through, training people who are going to be watching these younger workers on how to use the teach back method or practice asking an open-ended question. But, I'm not to be shameless, I would say, what we did is we compiled a lot of the great resources that were developed by the Children's Center and by Jana, and when I first got into this, what really drew me to this was when I looked at the guidelines developed by the Children's Center, because they don't say you have to be 12 to do this task or you have to be 18 to do this task, because we know that all 12-year-olds and all 18-year-olds aren't the same. And they really broke it down and said, what are the skills you have to have? And then you can do a better assessment of your child. So we're not saying don't let kids work on the farm. We're saying let's put in some procedures, some training so we can do it safe.
The other piece that I would add to that, and the supervisor training very much alludes to this, but one of the supervisor responsibilities, whether that's a farm parent, whether it's a supervisor of a hired youth, or like Diane says, an informal supervisor that might be an older sibling or something, but one of the big responsibilities of any type of a supervisor is to assess that environment and mitigate hazards as much as possible. And there's a lot of questions from a lot of people about, well, how do I do this and what do I do? And so there's checklists and there's information available, but probably one of the best tools that I've seen out there is something called Safer Farm. And you can access it at saferfarm.org, and it actually is an inspection tool for your farm. And it actually lets you go and look at different aspects of your farm and identify what are the hazards and what are the risks here. And it gives you information on what they should look like so that you have an idea of how to address them. But again, as Diane mentioned earlier, that falls right straight back into the supervisor's lap. It's their responsibility to create that safe environment for those young workers, and actually even for young children that might be in that area for whatever reason, even if they're not working.
So I think this is a great tool. Checklists are really wonderful. But why not take everybody with you when you do the checklist? Make it a participatory approach. We know when we think about safety, getting people engaged at all levels. So have your kids walk through, and then you can say, hey, you should never go in there. Don't go into the pen with the bowl. Or when you get older, we'll talk about letting you do this. But make it part of that training and engage people.
All right, so I am being a little mindful of our time. So I want to ask one more question of the panel, and then we have some questions that we've gotten from all of you that I want to make sure we have the opportunity to ask. And so for this one, I know, Marcia, you sent me a slide on this, so I'm actually going to put that slide up. And that is about, are there laws, are there regulations in place that we need to be mindful of as well when we're talking about youth being on the farm? So I will get that pulled up here for you, Marcia, and then you can share a little bit about that.
So this slide actually talks about regulations, and one of the important things to realize about regulations for young workers in the agricultural environment is that, first of all, The labor laws are, the federal labor laws I'm talking about here, the federal labor laws are going to be different for agriculture than they are for other industries. There's a separate set of regulations for agriculture. And so hazardous jobs are banned for youth under age 16 in agriculture. They're banned for youth under age 18 in other industries. And the other thing, the important caveat with these federal regulations is that they don't apply to the family farm youth. So if I own a farm and my child is working on there, even if he's under 16 years of age, these laws, these regulations don't apply. Okay, so there's that exemption. There's also some exemptions for certain tasks. For instance, operating a tractor is considered a hazardous order task, and certain other pieces of equipment, and you can't operate them under age 16 if you're a hired youth worker. However, there are exemptions in place if you follow and meet certain criteria, such as tractor certification courses, and it will allow for the task to be performed at a younger age. So it's important that you understand not only what the regulations are, and we're talking the regulations specific to agriculture, but also that you understand what the exemptions are and what the differences are as far as age and school hours and wages. There's all of these things are laid out in these federal regulations, and they need to be complied with if you have hired youth. Now, again, if you hire your own child, that's something different. But if you hire a neighbor child, then you have to comply with these regulations. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that there are state regulations that in many states are more restrictive than the federal ones. And so you always need to make sure you check for state regulations as well.
So going to the Q&A portion, just kind of, we want to be cognizant of everybody's time, and we've had some questions come in, and one of the questions was when you were referencing these resources, are others allowed to use them? For example, we've got other extension educators on, and they're wondering if they can share those resources within their newsletters and things like that.
Absolutely. The more you use them, the more the message gets out. So they are, as I mentioned, the resources we've developed, there's no cost for them. They're all available online. We'll send the links out to them, and please use them. And we'd love for you to adopt them.
Yes, and I saw a question in the Q&A too. The resources that were mentioned today, as well as additional resources, will be emailed out to all of our attendees today. And I believe that Diane, Marcia, and Jana will be fine with me sharing their contact information as well, if you have specific questions for them. So yes, you will be receiving those things. Keep an eye out on your email. I will email those out for you. Another question that we got that was really good that I want to make sure we get to is, this is for any of the three of you. Can you speak to traumatic brain injuries of youth on farms? Is that something that we're seeing a lot of? I know, Marcia, you had talked about tractors and equipment a lot, and I would imagine that TBIs are certainly a result of some of those incidents.
Yeah, tractor rollovers, especially when we're looking at tractors that don't have the rollover protective structures, ATV rollovers, when people aren't wearing helmets, equestrian incidents when the youth don't wear helmets, and in some scenarios, in some regions, equestrian helmets are a big battle. Other areas, they're pretty commonplace, and in some areas, they're more of a battle. But that's a huge cause is horseback riding without helmets on. ATVs and not wearing helmets is a problem. And then there's things like we had a case where there was a small child and he was playing in the barn, and there had been a gate that was kind of propped up, and the gate fell over and landed on the child's head. So there's those types of incidents as well. So yeah, absolutely, it can be a big problem in these areas.
Yeah, and I know just from personal experience, I would add to I grew up on a dairy farm, if my background wasn't a giveaway of that. And, we had a classic old, hip roof barn that had a hayloft above it. And so we had openings in the floor of the hayloft to drop hay bales down to where the cows were. And more than once, I dropped bales on my siblings' heads and vice versa. So I think that also just being mindful of these different facilities, and especially these older facilities, what those hazards may be as it relates to any type of injury, but I think head injuries especially.
Mhm.
I,
Yeah, and
I
they-
just wanted to add to that next month is Brain Injury Awareness Month. So we just wrote an article in our blog post that we'll be probably posting next week will be all about that and about some tips to prevent that from occurring. So folks will have to check that out on our website.
And just a side note, they do make what's called hay hole covers that will cover those holes in the floor, because it's not just a matter of the bales coming down and hitting somebody, but actually when you get smaller children up in those hay lofts, or even adults, there's lots of incidents of them falling through the hay holes and actually injuring themselves. And some of those, of course, are brain injuries as well as broken bones.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I know we had the hay hole covers, which was good. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Marcia. I had a question here, and it's kind of come up already about agritourism, specifically, youth farm safety concerns with, and I've never heard of this, programs like harvest hosts where RVs can overnight camp at farms. And I know I've talked to producers that have thought about doing like camping with cows things and having people out on their pastures and that. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure what my question is here, but what kind of, with those safety concerns, what do we need to be mindful of on the agritourism side?
Yeah, the farm stays have become a lot more common, whether you're talking dude ranches, whether you're talking bed and breakfast, whether you're talking the RVs that this particular person brought up. Again, you're bringing people in that may not and are likely not to be familiar with that environment and may not understand the hazards. In some of these operations, they even allow the people to assist with the farm chores, which can increase the hazards to the visitors. There's a lot of information that's available on the Integrating Safety into Agritourism website, and that website is designed for farm owners of these agritourism type operations to use to increase the safety of their farms. Because of course, one of the big worries that agritourism operators have is that somebody's going to get injured and they're going to end up getting sued. So this website, that particular website with agritourism safety, was developed for the farmers' benefit, for them to hopefully reduce their liability by increasing the safety of their farm operations.
Yeah, we've got a couple other quick questions here before we hit the noon hour, for those that are in Central Time at least. And so Marcia, you talked about, the federal rules and regulations, and we had a question come in asking, how far does the word family really extend when it comes to youth workers? Is it just children and siblings, or grandchildren, cousins, nephews, nieces? What does that word family really encompass?
Well, it's a little bit of a gray area in the laws, and Diane can maybe feed into this as well, but the law actually reads, and this isn't an exact quote, but it reads something like a parent or the person that stands in the place of the parent, which
So-
of course leaves pretty broad interpretation. Diane, you were going to say?
Well, I think there it's, you kind of think of the direct descendants. So grandparents would probably be considered, and also other family members. And these operations, often it's complex who the owner is. Maybe it's the group organization, and so everybody's children in that group organization. All the siblings may own it. But I would say too that parents can also give permission for their kids to work on a farm at younger ages. So it's a pretty broad definition, and there's been pushback because people don't want regulations. They don't want to be told how to do their job, and so we're not trying to regulate that. If we take the approach of we want to keep it safe, that's going to maybe get around this problem. Why would you behave differently versus someone who's hired on your farm versus someone who's a child of the farm. You know, we want to protect all children.
It's yeah, I agree with that, Diane, 100%. Keep in mind that when these issues come up, the ultimate decisions are going to be made by the court system. And we do have a case in our files where an uncle actually ended up getting fined as a violation for the child labor laws because he hired his nephew. At that particular point, the court decided that he was not considered to be standing in the place of a parent, that this was a hired youth situation. So even though it was a relative, in that particular instance, they determined it was still hired and the laws were still applicable. So in those kind of gray areas, it's going to be the court system that's going to make that decision.
All the more reason to be more cautious than less cautious.
All right, so I see that we are just a minute after here, and thank you to those of you that are still hanging on with us. I saw that we did have one final question about educating newer emerging farmers, you know, those that maybe don't have that you know, built-in experience of growing up on a farm. And I do know that there are a lot of organizations that are working on that, University of Minnesota Extension included in that. You know, how do we reach these people that have always dreamed of having a farm and they're realizing that dream, but don't know, you know, the ins and outs of livestock safety, tractor safety, etc. So I don't have a really thorough answer on that, but that is something that people are looking at. So thank you so much for asking that. As we wrap up here, I am, if I can get my mouse where I need it to be.
Emily, just a quick comment on that. One of the things that we've been doing at the National Farm Medicine Center is working with beginning farmers and ranchers groups, and also with organizations like MOSES, which is the Midwest Organic Sustainable, I'm sorry, I'm lost the rest of the acronym, but there are a lot of beginning farmers and ranchers as well. So people who belong to these types of organizations, these beginning farmers and ranchers and MOSES and these, if they want to request more information on these types of things, those connections are made. And so if they ask for it, we'll certainly come in and work with them on it.
All right. Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that.